This podcast is made possible through the kind donations of listeners like yourself. By committing to a small recurring donation via PayPal or Patreon, you're helping me to put the show together. If you are a regular subscriber and would like to help, go to www.podcast.com and click on donate for details. If you ever wondered what I look like, you'll also find a short video of me there. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I've been planning to look at some individual soldiers' stories for some time. The first was going to be the story of a British Green Howard who fought through from Dunkirk until the end of the war. As his story is similar to my great uncle's, everyone in my family was interested, and the book has gone on its travels, passed from my mother to my sister to my brother, and as of right now, I haven't got it back. But in the meantime, I was given the opportunity to talk to Frank Lavin about his father's wartime experience. I jumped at the chance. Frank has gathered together and organised his father's letters that he posted home during the war. Carl Lavin was a high school senior in Canton, Ohio, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Canton, Ohio native was 18 when he enlisted, a decision that would take him with the US Army from training across the United States and Britain to combat with the 84th Infantry Division in the Battle of the Bulge and then through to the occupation of Germany. The book is Homefront to Battlefront, an Ohio teenager in World War II. There is a link on the website. Frank, thanks for joining me. I think it's interesting reading letters rather than a memoir. As the letters were written at the time, you get a very honest account, whereas with memoirs, you never know what has been added after the event when they've gone away and looked something up or they've been influenced by other things. Frank, that's why I think these letters from your father are so interesting.
I think in these letters, if I may tout a bit, I think these letters have extraordinary advantage of authenticity. That's a kid's real voice. He's saying, you know, you want to know what's funny? I'll tell you what's funny, what's outrageous, what's outrageous. You want to know what's really cool about London? You know, they've got these funny coins here. That's what's amazing. I mean, that's only an American teenager would say that. You know, your first trip to the UK, and you say, Mom, Dad, you wouldn't believe what happened, but they got these just shillings and florins and all sorts of crazy things here. But let me tell you how it works. I mean, who would write a letter to their parents saying, let me explain the currency system to you? I mean, it's as authentic as it comes. I mean, you're just a lunatic to write that down. But
well, you'd never get that in a memoir because it's such a small glimpse.
Yes, but it reveals, I think, a mindset because obviously, substantively, it's completely unimportant whether he. But as a mindset, he's also to defend it. He's also saying, look, anything that's interesting here is all censored. I can't really tell you anything interesting. So all I can say is, my goodness, these coins are really kind of funny, aren't they? And it's what you say when you're trying to make conversation with somebody, right?
Yeah, well, we'll come to this. Let's start right at the beginning before we look at the detail of the experience too much. I mean, what were you writing the book with? Where did these packages of letters all come from that it's based around?
The history of the book started with me interviewing my father about 12 or 13 years ago, meaning I knew he had served. I knew he had been in combat, but I had never talked with him about it. And he would generally not talk about it, oblique references, but it wasn't part of his nature to talk about specific. And I realized as he was getting older that I didn't know what unit he served in. I didn't know where he was stationed. I didn't know where he fought. I just knew nothing about the specifics, so I interviewed him with that in mind and got 20 or 30 hours of interviews and typed it to transcribe about 40-page memo, only subsequent to that. So that document was for family purposes, so we at least know where he served or what units he was attached to. Subsequent to that, we found literally in the furnace room of the house in Ohio, my grandmother had saved about 200 letters that he had written her from the fall of 42 to about January 46. So about 4 years of letters describing basic training and other Army duty stations. And some were written during combat. Those are a little less detail oriented because you can't write about what's happening in the military at the time. But the huge advantage of uncovering these letters is you could then interspice them with what he'd previously told me, and we could go back to him and say, listen, we've got you situated at this point in Mississippi, and the letter's saying this, and I'm saying that, and it helped spur his memory. It was now aided memory, so he could provide more color. So then it turned into a much nicer project and allowed us to go to official Army documents, the official military history. Library of Congress has a lot of memoirs and unpublished documents. There are other sort of repositories of military history around that we're able to find other people in his unit and sort of piece together that jigsaw puzzle. So you had a very nice portrait of a young GI going through the process and going into combat and going into occupation.
It is, because the letters on their own are nicely smoothed out with the additional information, if that makes sense.
You know, what do you share in a letter with your mother, and how do you share it? For example, they liberate Salzwedel, a work camp, a slave labor camp for women. It's not a death camp, but these women are working in the armament industry, and they're displaced people and Jews or communists or just captive labor. And he talks about going to a dance with them after it's liberated. There's sort of a little festive violin playing or something, but he can't tell his mother, well, these are the women from the slave labor camp. There's no description of them being emaciated or beaten or, he's clearly very careful how he's describing these people, and it makes it sound like sort of a village dance contest.
So he started at the beginning of his war story, and his Uncle Bill states, I thought this was marvellous, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. That's ours. What was your father's background? Had the world events hitherto affected the family in Ohio?
I don't think they had, but I think he was aware of America's captivated by the war in Europe, much more so than what's going on in Asia. But don't remember, you have Edward Murrow broadcasting from London. This is London. We have all of Churchill's speeches are broadcast. So America can follow the war pretty readily in Europe. And Franklin Roosevelt is focusing on defense preparation, a war mobilization. A draft is set up, a peacetime draft. So there's movements toward the view that America might eventually be participating. The local newspaper has an essay contest, and he wins it with a essay on war mobilization or defense preparedness about the need for an industrial policy to allow armament industry to be strengthened. And I said for a high school student, that signifies to me that he's got a high degree of awareness about what's going on.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it does, really. And he volunteers. He
volunteers when he turns 18 to, I think, his parents' dismay. Both of his parents were telling him there's no need to volunteer because the whole country's going to war and you get called up sooner or later anyhow, so there's no need to jump the queue. Just bide your time. And I think like any American teenager, I think he said, there's no sense in that. Now, it's a little bit of a disappointment because he signs up at 18, which is the spring of summer of 42, but the country's not mobilized yet, so they can't pull him in yet. It just takes months and months and months for the army to get spun up. I think the peacetime army in 39 is 200,000 or so, or 1940 is 200-some thousand, and then it goes up almost 10x to 2.5 million in about 24 months. So it takes a while to absorb all of these teenagers.
I have to say that was something that I'd never considered so much as you volunteer, and then you're kind of, okay, you're in, but you're not in, and he basically sits it out at college waiting for call-up, doesn't he? Yeah,
they had a program called the Enlisted Reserve Corps, a little bit like what we now call ROTC, but it's a college-based program where at least you have a uniform, you have a drill, you're taught some military courtesy, so it's a very light touch, but you're at least in the system, but you're not actively doing anything.
Was there any benefits from volunteering? Bump in rank or more opportunities, greater pay?
He said there were incidental recognition and I think particularly when the war was over and they're demobilizing people, that you got extra points for being a volunteer as opposed to being a draftee. The serial number of volunteers begins with a 1. The serial number of volunteers for draftees begins with a 2. So everybody knows right away with the serial number that he's a volunteer. So you do get some courtesies, and I think there was a little bit of privilege at the end of things on repatriation back to the U.S.
Interesting that's not an incentive to start with, if you know what I mean. He volunteered because he wanted to volunteer. There was no incentive to volunteer because he knew it was going anyway.
Yeah, I think it. We could just supposition here is that, look, part of it I'm sure is just honest patriotism. Our country's been attacked. You better show up. You better sign up. And part of it had to be because his mom and dad are saying no need to do this. And he's on his own for the first time in his life. And he's saying, look, mom and dad, got some news for you. I've signed up. So part of it, I think, is that motivation as well. It's a teenager, asserting a bit of autonomy from his parents.
And when he eventually gets off to basic training, how does he find military life? Was it what he expected?
It's an adjustment of sorts, but he seems to grapple with it successfully. It's basic training. So the idea of basic training is not to punish people, but to get to people perform in a system. So a bit rigorous and little appetite for flexibility or creativity. You're supposed to just be performing in the system as a private in the U.S. Army. But he's reasonably athletic, bright, and always a genial disposition. So he can run with the best of them and keep up with things, and he's not a troublemaker by nature. It seemed to work out okay. I think what is a little surprising to him are a few things. One, that this is he goes through basic training at Fort Hood outside of Dallas, so he's in the deep South, and that culture is alien to him, and the heat is alien to him. And secondly, he's, as it was sort of 1 year of college at this point, he's in with a group who have significantly less education than he has, and that's, I think, kind of a surprise to him as well. But as he indicates, he could hit it off. He can play cards with people. He can tell jokes with people. But it's just a different group of folks that he had grown up with, people who not only never finished high school, but people who never even went to high school.
He seems to write home with a wonderful youthful enthusiasm, and I think, does he at one point call it a glorious adventure, which sort of almost hacks back to enthusiasm for everyone joining the First World War kind of thing, in my mind.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's saying, look, I've signed up for this thing. Of course they're going to be barking at you, and there's a sergeant whose job is to sort of berate you for something or other. You just got to be a good sport about it, do the best job you can, and keep your spirits up, and you'll get through it. And again, they're trying to train him. This isn't a punishment detail, or it's not a sadomasochistic. They're pushing people through. When he gets to Fort Hood, there are 95,000 people there, so they're just grinding. Every teenager in America has been ground through basic training to give these guys rifles and get them to the front.
He seems to want to better himself within military life. He must enjoy it to some degree, because he talks about enlisting for longer or applying for West Point, and he's certainly keen to join the Army Specialist Training Program.
Yeah, I think those are all fair points. One element of that, Angus, that comes through, I think, in the discussion is this is probably the first time in his life where he's ever thought about a career or what he wanted to do as a profession. And so it's, again, I would say somewhat typical teenager saying, I'm off to college, but I really haven't given a sense of what I'm going to do. And only when he's in this Army environment where all sorts of people are talking about promotion and career track and training that he says, well, I could be a part of that too. But he clearly finds that appealing at different times. And
he does get into the Army Specialist Training Program. What is that?
Yeah, that was, I think, the luckiest break of his Army service, although it had a downside eventually. But for the time being, the Army ASTP is a program that put Army enlisted people into college. The Army had denuded colleges so extensively of people for military purposes that the colleges needed people. And then the Army, I think, also realized initially that not everybody's going to go to the front anyhow. So let's come up with some kind of program to take the people with the highest aptitude, put them into this ASTP program. There's some 200 colleges that participated in it. There were 100 to 200,000 people who were going. So you're going through an accelerated college program. There's no sort of soldier requirement. You have to wear your uniform. You're going to class. But it's a real joy for the people in that program that they're not, doing maneuvers at night and cleaning things up and digging holes and so forth. So it's a bit of he's a lucky break for him that he gets admitted to this program and can spend, I think, 6 or 7 months in it until the whole program is scrapped or largely scrapped.
He's sent to New York, and he certainly said to enjoy himself.
Well, he'd never been to New York City in his life, so this is a real treat for him. He's in uniform in wartime, but he's not doing anything directly connected to the war. So he can enjoy the city. He can see Broadway plays. He can go to nightclubs and shows. He doesn't have a lot of money, but there's discounts or free tickets for servicemen. If you're in uniform, these things are 25 cents and so forth. So yeah, he is definitely enjoying himself. He has a girlfriend, a serious girlfriend. Life as a private is good. You're going to campus classes during the day, and on weekends the city is yours.
Clearly he's enjoying himself. He's regularly asking for more cash for his parents to subsidise himself. Was Army pay not enough? Or was that a reflection on how much he was enjoying New York?
I think you got a few things going on. Remember, the parents, my grandparents, his parents have two children, both boys. There's Carl, our subject, and then his older brother, Fred. Fred's in the Navy. Fred signed up in the Navy, and he's out in the Pacific. So mom and dad only have two kids. They're both in the service. They're both going to war. I think the point is, emotionally, this is a moment where if your son writes you and says, Mom, do you have $5? You're going to say, for God's sakes, take $5. You're not going to quarrel, right? So I think whether he knows this or he intuits it, I think he's just saying, look, I'm going to go see a Broadway show, and I want my mom to give me $5. Don't you think mom's probably happy to say, take the $5 and go see a show?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. London, New York, Paris, if you've never been and you're 18, they're kind of like Wonderland, aren't they?
Oh, it was the Emerald City. I agree. You have a USO club there where you can dance, the Hollywood Canteen, but this is a Broadway canteen, but the Broadway stars are there to dance with the servicemen, and free drinks, free donuts from the Red Cross, and free this and free that. And you're somewhat a celebrity, right? The town is yours.
Yet he never gets to complete the training program. It gets wound up.
So he starts in 43, and the program gets wound up early in 44 because as the Army is putting more and more men in the front, this program gets more and more criticism to say, how can you have 100 or 200,000 people in college when, in fact, people are dying in Italy and North Africa, and it's not really fair to the other kids to have this kid in college. So they basically wound up the program, with the exception of people in medical. So they decided they needed medical practitioners, so they kept it going. But everybody else is shipped back to a unit.
Does he go back to his original unit?
No, and this is the negative part of this. So they set up this program to say, we're going to take kids who have high aptitude, we're going to train them up a bit, and then there's some sort of unspecified career path out of that. But you've been selected for good things, is how it's sort of sold to them. So, of course, everybody says, well, they're taking us to college, so of course we're going to sign up for it. But when it's over, it's over. There's no increase in rank. There's no increase in pay. There's no increase in privileges. Not only is there no increase, but they're just distributed among units where there's shortfalls. So they're entering brand new divisions. They don't know anybody. They have no stature in that division. They could have progressed through the ranks in the course of a year or two just through performance if they were talented, but all of that was taken away from them. So actually you're taking sort of 100 or 200,000 the people you designated the brightest and who you trained up in college, and you just sprinkle them over all the regular infantry units. So it's a bit of a step backwards for the Army, and it's sure a step backwards for Carl. He's just thrown into the 69th Division at Camp Shelby in Mississippi.
When he went in, he was going to be in the. Was he going to be a driver on
tank destroyer?
Yeah,
tank destroyer. They train him initially at Fort Hood for tank destroyers. He's kind of excited about it. He likes it, and then he goes to ASTP, and they come out and they say, "My friend, you are an infantryman, and here's your rifle."
Yeah, but it's not just a rifle. They give him the Browning automatic, which is sort of an infantry-like support weapon, which is curiously a position of some responsibility. But how did he feel about that?
You're right. They said the BAR, Browning automatic rifles, the barmen were always a little proud because they had the heavier weapon. It was a little more significant. It was a little more dangerous because the distinctive sound of the BAR meant the Germans knew it and you would attract fire. So you're sort of a point man in a lot of infantry activity. But because of all of that, the barmen always felt a little proud that they were playing a special role. He also is quick to note, Angus, that he was assigned this weapon not because he passed a test or he was a good shot or what you might expect, but only because he's a tall fellow. He's 6'2", and so they said it's a heavier gun. You're big enough to carry it, so all the tall guys get the BAR, right? And so just because of size, he was given the heavy gun.
When they eventually shipped to Europe, it's October 44. He arrives in Britain. He's never been to Britain before. I mean, how does he find war-torn Britain when he gets off at Southampton, which Southampton itself will have been bombed heavily?
Oh, he's a huge Anglophile. First of all, I think every American knows that Britain has been fighting for 2 years longer than the United States. So there's this stoicism the Brits have that really win the hearts of the Americans, right? And then when you get to London, even as a sort of tourist, he had one weekend in London, and then he had some time at the occupations back in London. There's just enormous amount of charm, and it's a combination of that British stiff upper lip with architecture, history. He goes to the West End plays once when he's at occupation. He's just captivated by London. So and I know as his son that this orientation remained with him his entire life.
What amused me, and he mentions it also when he's in Europe, what amused me is his reference to an awe that buildings are made of stone.
Well, he says he's got funny things about, London's different or something. He's got this sort of a wonderland view of what did you think it was going to be? I mean, holy cow. Would it be useful to read a letter or something? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, sure. If you've got one pertinent to hand.
Okay, this is December 1944. He's been in Southampton a few weeks, and he gets a weekend pass to London. So he's writing his mom and dad about it. Just returned last night. Here's what I did. Got up at 4 a.m. Monday morning to go in trucks a distance of 20 miles so we could catch the train. I suppose you've heard how the coaches over here are built. Even the third-class ones are separated into compartments, and each compartment has its own door to the platform. These trains are considerably more comfortable than ours, little noise and rattle, and almost no sway. Reached London with quite a confused air, not knowing or being with anyone that knew what was what, but we got to our room, which had been arranged for us, near Russell Square, after a certain amount of confusion. It was somewhat on the order of a garret, but warm and clean. Half the building is demolished, but not the half we stayed in. It was done before, by a bomb, I presume. From there, we went to Piccadilly Circus, which is sort of the center of things. You see, London is not like New York, with a Times Square from which everything radiates. It's more on the order of Chicago, with a large conglomerate downtown district. There are 4 or 5 main squares or circles or circuses, which are the centers of unofficial sections. Piccadilly, you might say, is the main one. Anyways, we went there. We went to the Rainbow Club, the main Red Cross club, to get ourselves oriented, which we did, approximately. We went to a show in the afternoon, Strike Me Again, a musical comedy with Sid Fields, one of the big comedians. It's very similar to New York musicals, although not quite so lavish in costuming and scenery. The jokes and acts were no more subtler nor cruder than New York, but a bit different, of course. Anyways, we did enjoy it, which is more than I can say for some I saw in New York, although some of that enjoyment may have come from the difference itself. I was surprised at one thing, how very similar the dance routines are to New York's. They were a mixture of jitterbug and ballet mainly, and pretty good. They can and do jitterbug here just as well as what I've seen in the States. Now, in the evening, we went to a couple of dances. First, to one in this Rainbow Club, where I met one of the nicest girls I've yet met in the Army, but couldn't get her address. And then to a public dance hall, where my friend and I took out 2 English MPs, female. I'll have to continue this tomorrow because the mail goes out right now. Happy birthday, Mom. Love again, Carl. So that was a typical note. He's just, I think he's enthralled. I think he's just having the time of his life before he goes into combat.
It's when he talks about the differences, but they're not different.
Yeah.
That's what I find wonderful.
Yeah, I thought it was funny where he says, the dancing is the same. Well, what did you think? I mean, there's a global culture out there. What do you really think Jitterbug would be I don't know, but he's sort of one incredulous. I believe he was expecting the Viennese waltz or something in London. I don't know.
Well, I was going to say, I wonder if people lose that now because everyone sees TV and you see things, so things are so much more familiar. But I was going to say, the first time I went to New York, I was not, some 20 years ago, I was in sort of, I could have written a very similar letter from New York to my parents going, and it's different, but the same. And shock. And even though it's brilliant. Absolutely.
I think it's typical about what Americans find in London, that it's in that zone of familiarity, but just enough, something happens that's just a little bit different and you notice it, and then everything's kind of the same, but then something else happens, et cetera, et cetera. So think of London in wartime for Americans. It's sort of this beacon of the struggle, right? We've been holding out and fighting back, and now you fellows are joining us, and welcome to town. So it's got a very strong emotional appeal, I think, to any American.
And I guess when you first come over, it's also got that edge because though it probably feels safe, you are on what is the periphery of the war insofar as it is bomb damage, you can see damage, and potentially you could be in an air raid or a V2 strike or something. So there's that edge of danger. It's almost like slowly sliding them into the idea that it's real rather than in the US.
You're absolutely right. There's enough of a war tempo there that this is for real. There'd be wounded people. There'd be war relief charity drive, scrap metal drive. So the whole city would be engrossed in the war, and you couldn't escape it. That it's a mobilized society, and you're right. The tempo of life has picked up a bit.
And it certainly picks up for him very quickly as they rush to France to plug losses in the Ardennes campaign. How does he feel about his first foray into combat?
He had that Churchill quote he said was right on target, that there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at without effect. That your first moment where you're under fire is actually exhilarating. Now, that changes very rapidly, but you wanted to get in the show, you're in the show. And they shot at you and you're okay. So you can make a go of this thing.
It's a definite change in the tone of his letters now as well.
The real unfortunate bit is he's not allowed to communicate anything that is material. And, the sergeant is telling you as a private, listen, fellas, your mom's worried sick about you already, right? So what kind of a letter are you sending back? You're going to make her more worried? Is it really helpful to you or to her to say things aren't so good? For God's sakes, be a man, write something upbeat, let your mom feel a little bit better about you. So you're sort of guided to these sort of neutral or positive notes, which I think are hard at this moment. I mean, there's not a lot of good news there, but he sure doesn't. I think you can accept the premise. He's sure not going to communicate bad news, even if there's not a lot of good news. So the letters become a bit dry, a bit distinct, because there's nothing but bad news. This month or two of very heavy combat, and remember, they're losing more people in the unit than are being replaced. So the unit itself, the company itself, is being ground down. Within 30 days of combat, he's in the top half of seniority of his company. So these companies have 150, 180 people. I mean, they've lost half their people. Half these people are replaced, and they're not getting the replacements, right? So they're just being ground down. And it only takes a few weeks of that before you say, you know what, we're on the losing end of this process. I mean, there's not going to be a happy ending here.
There's a change in expressions of love, affection, thanking his parents, almost a loving fatalism comes across.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, one or two of these letters are almost peculiar, that you'd say there's not a teenager in America, maybe a teenager in the world, that would write what he's writing. And the only explanation for a sentence of saying, dear mom and dad, I just want to tell you how much I love you, is to say this is a fellow who's facing a death and assumes that it's all going to be over very soon, and he just wants his last communication to his parents to be one that is a loving letter.
It is quite touching. And that winter of 44 is very harsh, and it's a winter that my father always remembered, partly because my father's first truck that he drove in France was shipped back from the desert and had no heater, and when he described it as it eventually just fell to pieces, and they were issued with US-built Studebakers, which to his dying days he loved because it had a big seat at the front and it had a heater. But he had always said about the winter of 44 it was the coldest on record. I have no idea whether it was the coldest on record or not.
It broke records. It was unseasonably cold. It was a bitter cold. I think I can give you here's a quote from Corporal Wolf, who's in the 334th Regiment. So my dad's in 335th, right? But this is the battle. It said, it was an impossible problem for the infantrymen. Even with the best of care, he stood a good chance of frostbite. Too much clothing would restrict him in an attack. Too little would freeze him in the preparation. Physical exertion would make him sweat. Rest would freeze the perspiration. Dry socks were passed out in chow lines, and men wore a pair around the neck to keep them dry with body heat. Overcoats were discarded for many layers of clothing. Typically, a man wore 2 or 3 wool undershirts, a wool sweater, 2 shirts, and a combat jacket. Some men preferred 2 combat jackets, one to wear normally, the other be wrapped around the feet in stationary position. Men let their hair grow long and slept with helmets on to gain the last possible heat. So it's a bitter, bitter moment.
Did your father ever talk about it later, how cold it was? Had it etched itself in his memory?
Yes, he would certainly say that. I mean, he would say it would take you several hours to dig a foxhole because you had to break through frozen soil. You had to chip at the soil. It wasn't digging a hole. It was chipping at ice-encrusted dirt. And he said the bitter times where you spend several hours digging it, and then your sergeant comes along and says, listen, we've got to tighten up the line, fellas. We're going to advance 100 yards, and you're going to have to redig again. And so it was just a fatiguing, when it's so bitter cold, you can't really sleep. You don't really recover. So it's just a degenerative process where every day you're worse off, you're worse off, you're worse off. But there's no relief because there's not the manpower to allow the normal rotation every few weeks, take somebody off the line for a day or two for a hot shower and so forth. They can't do that. So just this debilitating process.
And in all this, he witnesses a prisoner of war incident, doesn't he?
Well, there's a very sad incident toward the end of the Battle of the Bulge where 4 German prisoners of their company, are shot as prisoners, which is shocking. It's shocking to read about. It's shocking to think about. And I'll tell you, as you read the history of the Bulge, execution of prisoners happened. So it's certainly these people disgrace their uniform. It's certainly nothing to be proud of. But boy, is it troubling when you see it close up. He doesn't participate in this. He's not pulling the trigger, but boy, it's his company, and he knows that it's going on. But there's nothing he can do about it as a private at the front in the middle of winter. There's nobody to call or talk to about this. But it's a very disturbing, very troubling moment. And I think what's interesting to note is prior to this, he talks regularly about an Army career, Army training, officer training. Subsequent to this, I think he's sort of saying, I've just got to get out of this madness. This is just bad news, and I've got to get out of it.
Yes, I think you're right. They're probably, because there is a sort of I'll come to that later, how he thinks by the end. That never occurred to me. There is always that grey area. What struck me about it, there's a grey area in prisoners where if you're going to surrender, when you immediately surrender is the greyest time because you don't know what's going to happen because you're kind of between things. But this is not that moment in battle. It's not the white hot heat of battle confusion. It's a deliberate act.
Yeah, no one can defend this, and it should not have happened. I mean, it's a terrible incident. I think if you were talking to Leonard, I think he'd say, listen, we're losing men. They're not being replaced. I've got 4 German prisoners, and I need to have 4 GIs on rotation guarding them. I can't do that. There's no way. We can't return the prisoners to any kind of stockade. We're not talking to them. So I just don't have a choice. Just to keep my platoon intact, to keep my company intact, we just had to do it. Right? I assume that's the rationalization about that. I mean, I don't look, that's not an acceptable rationalization, but I think you're just saying this is the exigencies of war. And I'll tell you, Angus, what is really troubling is when you read the formal military histories about POWs, it happened. This isn't isolated. Sometimes it happened out of rage that somebody sees their friend killed, and then the next Germans they come across surrendered, they just shoot these fellows, right? Because they're just in a moment of sort of temporary insanity. So there's bad things happen at wartime, is the lesson from this.
The next objective is the Rhine, and they get to the Rhine and sit on the Rhine. And at this point, he actually meets a lot of German prisoners of war, and he has just a chance to see them close up. What does he think of the enemy at this point, face to face?
What's really interesting about him is that he has no bitterness. He's not impassioned hater. He doesn't sort of hate anybody. I asked him about motivation and morale and patriotism. And I mean, his explanation was, look, we had been attacked. So, of course, we're going to fight. We're going to defend ourselves. We're going to fight back. And that's sort of the sum total of his logic. It wasn't this lengthy speech. In fact, he always said one of the false moments in any Hollywood version of the war is somebody sort of stands up and declaims against Hitler and says, by the way, the Nazis are pretty bad fellows. We ought to go get them. But it said nobody ever had to say. I mean, everybody's highly motivated. Everybody knows we've been attacked. Everybody knows they're trying to kill us, and we better kill them. So you didn't have to sort of speak to the GIs to say, I've been reading up on this, and Hitler's actually a pretty bad fellow. Everybody got that. Everybody got that. So you didn't have sort of lengthy philosophical discussions about what the point of the war was. It was just we better beat these fellas, and the sooner we beat them, the sooner we go home.
It's funny that not necessarily direct animosity against their fellow man. It's kind of against the greater thing, which I guess you don't see when we're face to face with the opposition like that, when they're disarmed and there's no reason to.
I think he's sort of fatigued as well, and he's not. I mean, he's basically an even-keeled guy by his own disposition. I mean, he doesn't go through life with a chip on his shoulder, right? So he's got no, personal grudge toward the people he meets. And he said, indeed, the main emotional response from the German civilians is one of fear. And I think the German people had been so misled by their own propaganda that all of a sudden a million GIs show up on their front steps saying, "What's for dinner?" I mean, it's just baffling to them that how could it have gone so poorly, and maybe their own radio wasn't telling them the truth, and they're all in shock as well.
Talking about German civilians, I was going to say some looting, but that's not what I was going to ask about. At this point, they're starting to move into Germany. They're talking. They're not. How is their relationship with the Germans, civilians? In our narrative, it's not full of looting, is it? But
I think it's more of a help yourself. I don't think there's looting, at least not with his unit, in terms of taking things for pillage or something, because there's no. Well, he just doesn't do that. But they have no problem at all going into a house and finding the pantry and saying, "Oh, there's some jam here, and we're going to kill the chicken in the pen, and we're going to have a chicken dinner." So there's no problem at all helping yourself to what the household has. There's no mechanism for actually finding the family jewels and shipping them back to the U.S. There's none of that is described. I'd be pretty surprised. He references, I think, in a note to his brother, I'm going to try to find a sidearm for you or something for you, but they're getting kind of tight on what we can mail. So clearly, the higher ups on the Allied side, I think saw the potential for pillaging or really unsavory acts, and they said, it's okay to run a letter back, it's okay to send a souvenir back, some Nazi emblem or something, but we can't have somebody shipping candelabras back or something. So you don't see any incidents of that.
Did he bring anything back?
He brought a pistol back, a Luger, that he took off, but he got that at the Elbe, where they're at the final days of the war. They're at the Allies stop at the Elbe, and the Russians come up on the other side. So of course, on the far side of the Elbe, all of the Germans are trapped there, are trying to get. They get it that the American sector is going to be more congenial to them than the Russians, so they're trying to get across. So one German officer in a rowboat, had a Luger, and my dad disarmed it. He kept that. He had that until his children were born, and he said he just wasn't comfortable with a pistol around the house with kids, so he got rid of it. But that was his one sort of armament that he took back. He had a Nazi brassard, a Nazi armband that he took off of somebody $2 or $3, but he found some old Weimar currency that he thought was it's very colorful, engraved 1920s, 100 million Reichsmark or something. So he's got some odds and ends like that, but he didn't have an enormous amount of collection items.
No, my father never brought much back, but it's funny. He didn't even bring his uniform back, but it's funny. When, growing up, this stuff was, 10 a penny. We all played, armies with genuine World War II era surplus, and now it's all like hen's teeth.
No, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. It was the whole. I mean, you'd sort of say, do I really need to pick up a German assault rifle because there's 100,000 of them lying around? I mean, what's the point of taking that home? And some people, this Nazi memorabilia, they had so much emphasis in Nazi Germany on regalia and appearances and all of the Albert Speer kind of imagery that has a certain appeal to people because it is very dramatic. And my dad he had the armband, he had the one pistol, and that was basically it.
But to be fair, you could probably carry them easier than busts of Hitler and various other things. If you have to lug them about.
Yeah, I could see if you were in occupation in some kind of administrative capacity, you probably had access to some kind of air freight or shipping mechanism, and you could, maybe you could be a little more involved with it. But my father was a private, then became a private first class. So he was a foot soldier.
He's somewhere around this time he's singled out as being Jewish and asked if he would like to visit a concentration camp.
Well, there's actually a very interesting historical moment when Eisenhower visits one of the camps. Because I hadn't heard of this either. But this comes out of Eisenhower's visit, meaning he goes to the camp and he takes Patton or Omar Bradley or somebody with him, and he is so shocked by this that he sends out this order. But bear with me for 1 second. I'm looking at the directory, and Eisenhower sends a note to his wife, in a letter to his wife, this is from his personal papers. I never dreamed that such cruelty, bestiality, and savagery could really exist in this world. This is after he sees, I'm trying to think what was it that he saw. Eisenhower goes to one of the death camps and is so offended. Patton is there too, I believe. Patton gets physically sick. That's when they send out a directive to the troops saying, listen, any Jewish GI who wants to can take a day leave or half-day leave. We'll have a truck take them so they can go through these death camps. Because Carl, he said he's called into the company commander's office, the captain's office. He says, commander wants to see you. And he's there in the waiting room, and there's three other Jews. And they sort of know these are the other three Jews so there's 4 Jews in the company of 150 or whatever. They all sort of know each other. And the company commander calls them in and says, you've got this option. If you want to go, this is an order from Eisenhower. And my dad decided not to do this. He just doesn't have the stomach for it. He said later that he regretted that decision, but he just couldn't look at that kind of cruelty in the face.
Yeah, I guess it's easy to regret it later, but at the time when you're seeing so much horror around you as it is, it's quite understandable.
Yeah, I agree too. I think it's just so unsettling, and somebody comes to you and says, hey, soldier, would you like to see something even more unsettling? I think you're sort of saying, look, I'm seeing my friends get shot. I'm shooting. I don't need to see something even more terrible than that. I'll just take, no, thank you.
Mm. When he gets to VE Day, when the war finally ends, how did they all celebrate? My father couldn't remember it.
Well, the one point that comes in mind that there's joy, but it very quickly turns to a sort of fatalism about Japan, and this comes through in my father's letters as well. That the assumption of the entire division is, listen, we're going to be shipped back to the U.S. There's going to be a few weeks off or whatever, maybe some more training, and then we're in for the invasion of Japan, and that's it. So there's a very fatalistic, a very kind of grim view of the victory to say we're only halfway done here, fellas, and the real hard work is in front of us. And in fact, he talks about Harry Truman and Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb and how that even today is somewhat controversial about why did he do it? Did he need to do it? And my dad says, look, I'm glad he did it because I was supposed to be in on that invasion. So he might have saved my life. So Truman did the right thing.
Yeah, I don't know if you are aware of George MacDonald Fraser, who wrote the Flashman novels.
Yeah, I know the novels, yeah.
So if you read, George MacDonald Fraser served in Burma, and he has a whole piece at the end of his memoirs about how the best thing that happened was them dropping the bombs, and he doesn't care how inhumane it was because it saved his life.
I think that would have been the typical GI's view of saying, the sooner the better we wrap this up and we can all go home and go ahead and drop it. You couldn't have been an American president and said the opposite. You couldn't have been an American president and said, listen, we've got this bomb, but it might kill 50 or 100,000 civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so we're not going to do it, fellas. You guys go storm the islands, okay? I said you would have had more people killed on a frontal assault.
Yeah, that's another checkbox of because my father was of the same opinion, and my father couldn't remember VE Day. He said it's just another day to him, but he was also past fit to go to the Pacific. So I guess from that point of view, it also saved him being shipped to the Pacific.
Well, also, my dad would say, and this comes through also in the book, that look, in the final week or two of the war was over. The Germany had completely lost the will to fight. They weren't meeting any opposition anywhere. They could drive their trucks down the Autobahn, and go from town to town, and everybody sort of knew it was over. You still had to be careful. There could still be somebody out there, but the point is they sort of just waiting for that formality of somebody to sign some document and say it's over. With
the fighting over, and he has time now to reflect on his role, being the light support carrying the BAR. He must have killed people. Did that weigh upon him?
Yes, he didn't like the business of killing at all. He thought there was no glory in it. I think that's one of the reasons why he didn't want to talk about it, is that he didn't want his children getting the wrong impression that the cause was a noble cause. We could all be proud of the Allied effort, but the individual acts of taking someone else's life is horrific, no matter what the circumstances. So you can be proud of your service, but you shouldn't be proud of having to kill somebody.
And it's around this time he starts to talk about feeling homesick. I mean, I wonder why. Is that a response to the adrenaline wearing off, or he didn't enjoy being in the army of occupation? Or
no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, look, it's one thing to say we've got our mission, which is to beat Hitler and to win this war. We've won. And I say my mission's over, and I don't want to spend the next year of my life guarding some roadblock or something, checking ID cards or something. So, I'm just ready. I'm just done with this, and I'm ready to go back home.
And that is very much what they were the army of occupation. There really wasn't much for them directly to do. He sounds very bored.
Yeah, although it probably took several weeks or several months to sort of figure this out, because there was this whole consciousness that in World War I we did not occupy Germany. This allowed Hitler to come to power. We've got to come up with some kind of mechanism post-World War II where we're playing a direct role in Germany to allow a democratic system to evolve. And so what do we need to do, and how long do we need to be there? I mean, we're all legitimate questions at that time.
His next posting, once they remove him from France, he's sort of halfway, how to do here back, he's sent to operate some newfangled IBM machines in France. How did war-torn post-war France compare to Germany in late 45?
I think this was a real low point for France. It was first because the combat activity took place there was an enormous amount of physical destruction. Second of all, France had not sort of fully redeemed itself politically or emotionally from the shock of the Nazi victory, right? I mean, they just had a terrible war, a terrible occupation, and now it's over, but there's been no reconstitution of French government at that point. So it's really sort of a low point. We have a great nation, but it's not perceived as a great nation at that point. And I think my father doesn't have a particularly pleasant time there either. I mean, there's nothing unpleasant, but I think he's just itching to get out of there. He's just itching. So he's not in a mode so he can enjoy France or visit France or see France. He's in a mode to say, would you please get me out of here as quickly as possible?
I just wondered how much he felt that the French didn't want them to be there. The war was over and they just wanted to get on with them. And didn't want. There was almost resentment, and he didn't like it.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a resentment, but I think you could say this: that in London there's a genuine feeling of alliance, solidarity, and shared purpose and collegiality, and there's just none of that in France. And France is sort of the battered child. They've been brutalized by the war. There's no happy ending there, even though the thing's over and they've got their country back. It's just exhausted. So he looks, for example, he takes a weekend trip during this time in Reims, which I think is only 2 or 3 months. But during that time in Reims, he gets a weekend trip to London and a weekend trip to Paris. He writes almost nothing about his trip to Paris, but he writes effusively about his trip to London, who he chatted with, what he saw, what he did. You can just tell there's just greater connectivity there. I think in Paris, he said, Mom, he wanted me to pick up print for you, and I tried to find an artwork or something. But he doesn't, it's sort of, what did you do there, and who did you meet, and who did you talk to? We don't really know. He's not connecting with Paris the way he's connecting with London.
We touched up in this before, the war changed his view of the world. I sort of wonder if he sort of had a political epiphany during the war and came out of it with quite set I don't want to say necessarily political views because that sort of tries to fit him into a party, but views on how he felt things should be.
Well, the one interesting point, and I'll look for this. I'll look for this as well, because he ends up, they've got these sort of army libraries, right? He's always a serious reader. He's always got a little bit of a intellectual bent, and he picks up a book which has been a huge bestseller, remaining so today, I believe, Will and Ariel Durant, The Story of Philosophy. So he's just reading sort of about the great philosophers. He's intrigued with the chapter on Spinoza. So this is from Spinoza's writings from Durant's History of Philosophy. Spinoza writes, "The last end of the state is not to dominate men, nor to restrain them by fear. Rather, it is to free each man from fear, that he may live and act with full security, and without injury to himself or his neighbor. The end of the state, I repeat, is not to make rational beings into brute beasts and machines. It is to enable their bodies and their minds to function safely. It is to lead men to live by and to exercise a free reason, that they may not waste their strength in hatred, anger, and guile, nor act unfairly toward another. Thus, the need of the state is really liberty." And so that's a very apt quote. And if you had just come through World War II, you would have said, this guy speaks truth. That if Germany had been organized along these lines, they would have been happy. We all would have been happy, and there's no need for Hitler to have seized power and so forth. So I think that kind of view about the government's role and a proper society and the value of democracy and liberty was imbued with him through that experience.
It's interesting because it obviously means enough to him. He's still, he must be early 21 now, isn't he? It must have meant enough for him to write home about it. It's not just something he was thinking quietly to himself.
No, he's very intrigued with Spinoza, and he writes his mother, because Durant tells us that Spinoza as a free thinker in even Amsterdam, which is a city of free thinkers, but at that time, I think 17th century, Spinoza is almost sort of a radical, and he is excommunicated by the Jewish community of Amsterdam. So my father's letter is to his mother saying, what's the background of this? How everything Spinoza is saying seems to be sort of humanitarian and rational, and what prompted somebody getting excommunicated? My mother ends up talking to the rabbi, the congregational rabbi, and he writes a very nice note to my father talking about Spinoza. And look, times are different then. Tolerance of independent opinions were just different then, and Spinoza enjoyed being a bit provocative, but there just wasn't the kind of society we have today where people can express themselves readily as to their view of government and religion and so forth. So I mean, he found a way to annoy people, and they found a way to repudiate him.
Well, I thought it was interesting. The war galvanized people in such a way. In Britain, a similar view might be expressed insofar as expressed insofar as Churchill, the great war leader, loses the election in 45.
It's in 45 because.
And
this is indirectly in the book. It's during Potsdam Conference that Churchill has to go home and campaign on the weekend. And during that, so Harry Truman's in Germany for a weekend, and Churchill said, "Look, I'll be right back." Of course, he didn't come back, but that's when Truman goes to review the 84th Division, because his cousin, Lewis Truman, is the chief of staff of the division. So that's when my dad encounters Truman, just in a parade review. But that's all because of Potsdam, and Churchill's defeat is shocking to everybody, at least everybody in the U.S.
But in retrospect, your father's writing home like that, and the whole of the British Army, is much more of a galvanizing, let's pull together kind of. Socialism's an interesting word because it means different things to different people, but it is that kind of more of a socialist outlook where we all pull together. And I sort of read that into what your father's sort of writing about. It's personal freedom. It's about everyone pulling together to do the right thing.
Well, and it's also, but first of all, you're right. Philosophically, this was sort of that post-war moment was sort of the high point of Fabian socialism. And I think there was a view to say, listen, we've we've won the war, and now let us construct a just society in which everybody can participate, and the prosperity of society is shared by all kind of. So you can see sort of the emotional appeal of that philosophy. My dad's looking at Spinoza's view. It's a different approach. It's saying a proper society is one in which the government is restrained and people can live lives according to their own choosing and without harming anybody else. So you're really, I think, looking at the evils of Nazism and saying if you just restrain that and let people live as they choose to live, you're going to have a better outcome.
Mm. Years later, beyond the scope of your letters, how did your father feel about the war? I mean, I think you mentioned you didn't enjoy war films particularly, thought they were nonsense and people's basking in war documentaries. How did he feel about it all? Well,
look, I don't think there's any question that it was 100% certain that it was a war we had to fight and had to win, and we did our job. So there was that sort of very fundamental philosophical view of the war. But you're right, he would always look askance at the triumphalism is bad, militarism is bad. There's this sort of hollow patriotism. And he was always a bit skeptical. He didn't feel entirely comfortable in the veterans organizations because, look, I think the veterans organizations are good organizations, but you can imagine in the late 40s, early 50s, some of the loudest voices would be, I think, voices that would rankle my father because of that kind of loudmouth patriotism, chauvinism or triumphalism, and he thought that's just not healthy for society. So he tried to get it. Yes, and he thought Hollywood depicted sort of always the sort of romantic or glorified view of the war. I could not watch the war movies because of how unrealistic they were. So
I have one final question. Throughout the war, when he's posted to Europe, he writes home to his mother to send fudge. Almost every letter has a mention of. Did he retain his keenness for fudge long after the war? Had he had enough of it?
I'll tell you, of all the blessings I have received from my father, of all the joy I have as being a son, I've inherited his sweet tooth, which I would say is a blessing. And I could tell you this: my father had a wonderful sweet tooth, and would purchase candy on a whim. I mean, far beyond it, and especially in his 70s and 80s, his memory wasn't always 100%. He had a good full life, but he would literally go out and run some errands, and every errand he'd go out, he'd buy a pound of chocolates, and he'd eat sort of one of them, and then the next day he'd buy another errand, he'd buy another pound of chocolates. So literally I'd come home to visit, there'd be sort of 8 or 10 pound, 1 pound tins and bags on the counter all over the place. And I'd say, God bless you, Dad. This is you are set for Halloween, aren't you? I mean, we're set if there's a flood or we're cut off. We've got enough chocolate. But he loved chocolate. He loved sweets. And it was glorious being his son because we always had a household of chocolates.
It's almost every letter. It really did make me chuckle. I wondered if the Eddie just had enough and just couldn't face it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Request for homemade fudge.
Yeah, it's hard to say whether there's something psychological there as well that he's, his mother's going to always respond and is always going to bake things and send things to him. So he's always going to have that kind of relationship with his mother in wartime. So that might have been part of it as well. But this was a man who needed his chocolates. And as you'll recall, a package of chocolates arrived from home. And one of the just at the moment where they've conquered and occupying a German candy factory, so he's got it is sort of a bit of Wizard of Oz where he's finally got this room full of chocolates and more chocolates yet come in from the U.S. All right, so but he seemed a very happy fellow.
Frank, thank you. Frank's book is Homefront to Battlefront: An Ohio Teenager in World War II. I will put a link on the website www.podcast.com. I very much enjoyed Frank's book. It enlightened me on some aspects of my own father's service during World War II, things I never thought to ask. If you're looking for a good book to take on holiday, you won't regret picking up a copy. That's Homefront to Battlefront by Frank Lavin. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, and for the next couple of weeks I'll be expanding on my chat with Frank with pictures related to the podcast. So give me a like to keep up to date and join in the conversation. I think that's enough for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.